Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We're excited that you're here with us today. Another session brought to you by the Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian STEP program from FHWA, Federal Highway Administration. So today what we're going to be talking about is how we can do a better job developing and then delivering pedestrian safety projects, really looking at sort of the processes behind delivering those projects and how we get things on the ground, and looking at specifically a case example from North Carolina. We'll hear from first from Becky Crow, the FHWA Office of Safety, to talk about the STEP program. We'll hear from Brian Mayhew with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, and then a story from the city of Raleigh, also in North Carolina, about how they do their projects there. So let me introduce our panel to you right now. We're not on video today, but you can see us right here on screen. First, I'll start with Becky Crow, who is a transportation specialist in the FHWA Office of Safety. Becky manages and provides guidance on matters related to road safety audits and the Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian initiative. Ms. Crow works closely with federal, state, and local and tribal and non-for-profit agencies to improve highway safety on our nation's highways. Before joining FHWA, she worked for a regional planning agency and the Virginia Department of Transportation. So we're very excited to have Becky with us today. Brian Mayhew is here as well. He is the State Traffic Safety Engineer for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Brian manages several transportation safety programs for the state. He works to establish comprehensive and multimodal approaches to ensure safety is sustainable in North Carolina. His intent is to have safety programs that deliver practical solutions and work to minimize harm to all road users. So we're really excited to have Brian here with us. And finally, Jed Niffenegger is the City Traffic Engineer for the City of Raleigh in North Carolina. Jed's previously worked as a project engineer overseeing capital project and as a structural engineer designing bridges. And he's been in the engineering field for approximately 20 years. We're really excited to have Jed with us today, and we're excited to have you all joining us for today's session. I wanted to take a moment and just cover a few housekeeping items. First, please do submit your questions during the webinar. I'll be responding to those if I can, or we'll be responding to those if we can, and we'll be monitoring them and trying to collect a lot of them together for the final Q&A period that we're gonna have at the end, about 25 or 30 minutes. So please ask your questions at any time. We'll try to get to as many as possible by the end of the webinar. We are posting an archive of this session at pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. We have already posted a link to a PDF copy of the slide presentation for today. I'll send that link out to you shortly, so you've got it right in your chat pod there. Please be on the lookout. Later today, we'll be posting a video recording of the webinar. So we're recording that now. We'll make that available on that website a little bit later today. If you're looking for certificates and professional development hours for this webinar, you're in luck, because we will be sending you a link later today and a follow-up email that has instructions for generating a certificate of attendance showing that you've completed 1.5 hours of instruction. So be on the lookout for that email. It'll be coming to you a little bit later today, about an hour after the webinar is over. And if you're a planner and you're looking to claim CM credits through AICP, we've had those approved for this webinar. Please go to their website and event calendar and log those as you normally would. I want to mention that we don't have dates yet, but we do have 2 STEP webinars coming up that you'll be interested in. Keep an eye out for the announcements for these. One will cover evaluating road diets and other lane conversion projects. So we're excited about that one. And then we'll be shifting and focusing a little bit on regional approaches to improving pedestrian safety, how MPOs and those types of organizations can really lead and do some important work on pedestrian safety in their roles. So we'll be sending out announcements about those as soon as they're set. Look for those in the next month or two. I'm going to now turn the screen over to Becky Crow, who will be sharing some information. Oh, I'm sorry, Becky, I'll keep the screen on my end. Becky Crow is here to talk about Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian initiative. And Becky, just let me know when you want me to move on with the slides.
Great, thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a great day today. I manage the Everyday Counts Innovation, Safe Transportation for Every Pedestrian with Peter Unn. And Peter's on the line as well today. We've been working closely with a lot of states to advance our Spectacular 7. Dan, I'll get you to forward the screen. And just if you're not aware of our Spectacular 7, I'm just going to run through these really, really quickly. They include road diets, pedestrian hybrid beacons, pedestrian refuge islands, raised crosswalks, crosswalk visibility enhancements, the RRFB, or rectangular rapid flashing beacon, and the PHB, the leading pedestrian interval. And all of these countermeasures are to make it safer for pedestrians when they're crossing the roadway. Dan, you can go to the next screen. If anybody wants a lot of detailed information on any of these countermeasures that I've mentioned, I encourage you all to check out our website. We have text sheets for all of the countermeasures. We have a number of videos, case studies, really whatever you need to get information on these. So I really encourage you all to take a look at our website. You can also contact me or Peter, and we would be happy to talk to you in more detail as well. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that I hope you were on the webinar last week, but we had a webinar that focused on our Step Up campaign, and we're asking states and local agencies to really tell us about their success stories. So if you have implemented one of these countermeasures and you've seen a lot of success with it, we really encourage you to reach out to Peter and I and give us the details, because we would like to highlight what you're doing. So I'm just really excited to hear from Brian and Jed, you know, and learn more about how you know, the states and cities are implementing these countermeasures quickly. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks so much, Becky. And I'll try to remember in just a moment. I'll send out the link to where you can watch that webinar if you missed it on the Step Up campaign that we just held last week. We've got that recorded and up on our website. I'm going to turn the conversation now over to our first panelist, Brian Mayhew from North Carolina DOT. So Brian, the screen is coming to you. I'll let you know when you're all set up. All right, perfect. I see your screen now, Brian. Please start whenever you're ready.
All right, thanks, Dan. I appreciate it. So I'm going to start off by just kind of sharing a little bit of information about why pedestrian safety is so important to NCDOT and so important to our safety programs that we have here in North Carolina. And one is we need to do better. We need to do more. And from a national perspective, the trends are increasing, as I'm sure most people that are joined us today are aware. That's true in North Carolina as well. In fact, pretty much however you look at pedestrian fatal crashes and serious injury data across the country, North Carolina is going to show up in the top 5 list or a top 10 list. And so it is something that we definitely need to focus on and need to continue to improve on. In North Carolina, our trends are not heading in the direction that we would prefer. The total crashes are up, and they're up significantly. Injury crashes are also up, and fatal crashes, unfortunately, those are up about 70% since the low in 2011. So we had around 136 in 2011 and 230 last year. Certainly deserves a lot of our attention. Pedestrian crashes are also unique in that there's relatively few of them. They only make up about 1% of our total crashes in North Carolina, yet then they range between 15 to 20% of fatal crashes. And so that can be challenging for many of our infrastructure-based programs where you have relatively few events, but they're so severe when they happen. So you really have to develop a special program to be able to focus on pedestrian crashes. Considering some of the information I just shared, it should be no surprise that when we updated our strategic highway safety plan in North Carolina in 2019, that the topic of pedestrian safety received a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and a lot of strategies were discussed on the infrastructure side, as well as engineering and education and encouragement. Today we'll talk more on the infrastructure side, but we did establish a goal of reducing pedestrian and bicycle involved fatalities and serious injuries by half by 2035 and move towards zero by 2050. So given the recent trend, this would be a significant undertaking. The Highway Safety Improvement Program is the primary program in the state of North Carolina at the state level that is devoted entirely to safety on the infrastructure side. We have three primary focus areas that connect directly to our strategic highway safety plan: lane departure, intersections, and then bike and ped. There is overlap between those three areas, especially between intersections and bike ped, and some between our lane departure focus area and bike ped as well. But bicycle and pedestrian safety has its own dedicated area of focus within our Highway Safety Improvement Program. Our pedestrian safety improvement program that's part of our overall HSIP has three main areas that we focus on. The hotspot is the typical one. That's the traditional one. It's very reactive. It means crashes have already occurred. There's crash data present. You're looking at that crash data and you're reacting to it and investigating that location with that crash data as the primary reason for visiting that spot. Corridors in North Carolina, our corridor program is combined crash data as well as risk data. They're very multimodal in nature. There's often transit in addition to bicycle and pedestrian and vehicle needs for those corridors. Some of those can be very, very complex as well. And then the third area is a relatively new area that we've added to our program that gives us an opportunity to really identify and focus with a lot of cities or large areas that are overrepresented in pedestrian crashes and fatalities. And this gives us an opportunity to really scale the data and the analysis as needed for that area. Instead of looking at the state as a whole, we're able to focus on a particular city and really use a lot of data and information to help us develop a work plan that may make good sense for that area. We'll go through these in a little bit more detail. Hotspots, again, very, very reactive. It's crash data based entirely. So they're going to show up in your population centers. They're going to show up where you have your population density and a lot of your exposure at universities and in urban areas. They are useful. They do bring attention. If you have a location that has experienced a lot of pedestrian crashes, it should be reviewed. However, the data is limited and you definitely need to supplement the crash data with other risk data to get a more complete picture. Pedestrian crashes move around a lot. They may be in one intersection one year and a different location the following year. So this is limited, but it is still part of our work plan. In addition to the HSIP reactive locations, we get a lot of requests from cities, a lot of public requests from universities and school systems, the public, and from our review of fatal crashes. Those are typically spots as well, and they are typically reactive in nature. So those requests are also handled as part of our hotspot program. Our HSIP corridors, like I mentioned before, they use risk in addition to crash data. They are still focused heavily in our urban areas. They can be anywhere from a half mile long to maybe up to 4 or 5 miles in length. They are mainly arterials. They're very complex. They have transit and multimodal needs. They may have higher speeds, much higher volume. They often have a series of issues in terms of high-risk intersections and sections, in between that definitely have a lot of specialized attention. The corridor risk scoring that we use in North Carolina still uses crash data, but it's minimized in its ability to affect the score. Roadway, in terms of factors from speed and crossing distance, volume, signal spacing, and sidewalk presence, is used. as well as different demographic or census type data such as land use or population density and vehicle ownership. This is an evolving area. A few years ago, this was not in place, and I'm sure in a couple years, this type of risk scoring will continue to evolve as we learn more about it. Our large and mid-sized cities, these basically the process here is to identify cities that are overrepresented when you consider their population and you consider the amount of pedestrian crashes and the fatal and serious injury crashes that are occurring. Then these cities are overrepresented when looking at that data, and this is very useful in determining how we engage those cities and start being able to bring more of our program to them to help implement the different countermeasures. So I think there's 17 cities on this map that make up about 56% of the pedestrian crashes in the state and over 40% of the fatal and serious injury crashes. With these cities, and this is an area that we're looking to continue to develop, and we'll spend some more time this year working with a few cities in particular that are somewhat mid-size, but really it allows us to adjust the scale of our safety planning and our analysis and use different risk-based screening methods, which will definitely factor on pedestrian volume generators such as stores and restaurants and schools, but also take a look at census data such as income and other factors so that we can assign a risk score to various roadway segments and then work and engage that city and essentially bring our HSIP program and bring the low-cost countermeasures to the city and be able to fully engage them and make sure that they're part of our processes. So with safety planning, there's a lot of data that's available. There's a lot of information. We just went through the reactive hotspots that's based on crash data. You can identify corridors using risk analysis and various information. There's small areas in cities, a lot of local government requests. There's a lot of interest in pedestrian safety. So it's very easy to generate a lot of choices for your program. As you wade through that, as you use that information and you start shifting to, well, now we need to deliver. We need to implement things as quick as we can. We need to get information to the right people at the right time so that we can develop projects and get those on the street. So the program delivery is a very important thing that we focus on in North Carolina as part of our efforts. Basically, we have three guiding principles that guide our program, and that's we want our projects to make sure that they're focused on reducing fatalities and injuries and not just total crashes. They need to definitely have a focus on those most severe events. That's what we want our program to have the biggest impact on. We want to maximize value, so we want to focus on a lot of low cost countermeasures, which really aligns well with the STEP program. Most of the countermeasures that Becky mentioned at the beginning are very low cost. They can really be implemented without a lot of constraints, and that leads to the third principle is we want to get the safety projects on the ground. We want to get them built quickly, delivered in a cost-effective manner. The best safety dollar you can have is not one that's in the bank, it's one that you've already spent, so that countermeasure has a chance to work. One of the issues that all state DOTs face is that as that length of time grows, from the time you identify a problem and a hazard until you can get a project developed and implemented, the longer time that takes, then that hazard that you've become aware of is continuing. That countermeasure, that solution that you have in place, can't start working until it's on the ground. So we really do put a lot of effort into trying to be able to develop our program in a way where we can get things, implemented relatively quickly. So with that, this is a typical safety project cycle. You would see this probably in many states and in some cities. One thing I want to point out about this project cycle for North Carolina is that it's It's continuous. This is not a 2-year or 4-year cycle. This represents a daily or weekly or monthly work plan within our program. We develop work plans off of the hotspot list, off of corridors in the city focus areas, and field staff are assigned field reviews continuously. These reviews are done with local government staff as well as other NCDOT staff. So if we are identifying locations that are inside the city limits, then that city is going to be part of the field review. The projects that are developed should reflect those key principles of our program, meaning low cost. It needs to absolutely define and address a safety problem where we're confident that that problem and that solution will reduce fatal or severe injury crashes, and one that can be implemented relatively quickly. The quarterly, the second orange box, is also a key part of our program. This, what I mentioned, that this is not a 2-year cycle or a 4-year cycle. By having, in North Carolina, by having a quarterly project selection and funding process, then if you become aware of a problem tomorrow, a pedestrian safety issue at an intersection or mid-block, and you have a solution for it, then with the quarterly project selection, you have an opportunity for that project to be selected for funding quickly, within months, within 3 months or 6 months. It can be funded, and then it can move on to the design, let, and construction process. And that's key, because if you have a solution and it's low cost, then having to wait for 2 to 4 years or for a longer cycle in some cases, we have found that to be somewhat of a limiting factor into how effective a safety program can be. So we do, this does generate a lot of work to run this program on a quarterly cycle, but we have found it to allow our program to be very reactive in getting low-cost projects on the ground. Some of the countermeasures that you would see should be very familiar. These are ones that we would often focus on for a signalized location, signal heads and marked crosswalks, LPIs. I think we'll talk more about that in a bit. Right turn on red, lighting, and curb extensions. There's hopefully going to be more added to this list. Left turns at signalized intersections are a very common crash type with pedestrians and vehicles. We look forward to continuing to learn more about different countermeasures that can really focus on that left turn pedestrian event and continue to broaden the use of those. That's one thing that we also do with our program, is we'll try to identify those gaps where maybe we have countermeasures that exist, but we're not using them to a great extent, or we have countermeasures that are new and untried, and we will typically try to work with different cities and locations to get those implemented and evaluate them so that then we can broaden the use of them across the state. At uncontrolled crossings, again, a very familiar list. These are the ones that we typically focus on. Crosswalks and refuge islands, your hybrid beacon and RRFBs. We will do traffic signals. Pedestrian traffic signals are not uncommon. We will do that when it makes sense to do so. And then of course, lighting and curb extensions as well. I'm going to take a few minutes and kind of step through a case study on a corridor. This is NC 54. So this is in central North Carolina in the Chapel Hill area. And this is one that we partnered on with the town of Carrboro and Chapel Hill and our consultant with VHB. And really, this was an interesting corridor in that, like a lot of our arterials, it's very complex. And in this one, you have traffic volumes ranging from 20,000 to over 40,000 vehicles per day. It is an expressway. It has interchanges in the middle and at-grade locations on either side. You have apartment complexes spread throughout the corridor that are somewhat landlocked, and many of the people living in those apartment complexes very transit dependent. So you also have bus stops all up and down the corridor where people are needing to cross the expressway in order to get to their desired bus stop. So certainly this is a location that we did not flag, but fortunately was not flagged based on crash data. There is surprisingly few pedestrian crashes along this corridor, but the risk is quite high. And one of the key things that we asked ourselves at the beginning of this project was, how do we take and acknowledge the various transportation plans that already exist in this area? How do we combine that with the data from today, such as exposure data, crash data, risk data, and then develop and implement solutions for tomorrow? And this was a little bit of a different process because of the complexity of the corridor. And each, when you look at what the cities and towns have already looked at in the area, there's greenway plans, there's pedestrian plans, sidewalk plans, there's other capital improvement plans, and there's a lot of knowledge that can be gained from those plans that we need to be aware of as we're implementing various low-cost solutions. So even though we want to try to get our solutions on the ground as quickly as possible, we need to step back and take a look and see what knowledge we can gain from the long-term plans that have already been developed, so that as we implement the safety improvements, we're doing so in a way that can supplement the work that's already been done and the work that's planned for the future. And so this was very useful to try to figure out where people need to cross, where can we improve crossings, and where can we plan for future crossings along this expressway. So this was a good example of a corridor program, and one that quite honestly is going to help us further establish our corridor program in the future. In addition to working with the cities and incorporating their plans, we did work with them on public workshops as well. And we used the public to kind of help validate some of the data and information, and also to receive their perspective. As we moved through the project, it gave us an opportunity to use the public to validate our recommendations, and we found that to be a very, very beneficial step. In the near term, this project was able to identify many low-cost improvements, signal phasing improvements, whether it was split side street phasing or LPIs, definitely signs and markings and visibility improvements, refuge islands and crosswalks were a common recommendation. One thing about this is we were actually able to implement some of those while the study was ongoing. It became pretty apparent at a few intersections that there were several low-cost improvements that we could do. And so we didn't even wait for the project to finish. We went ahead and used our HSIP program to go and implement those changes while the study was still going. And that's one way to continue to build relationships with the public and build relationships with the local governments, is when they can see how things can get done and how things can change, then it does help build that support for the overall project. There are more complex countermeasures as well that came out of this study, including changing some of the access control, some more complicated pedestrian signals and or hybrid beacons. And there's a couple areas around some interchanges that may have some road diets. Those are going to take a little bit more planning and design, so they will take a little bit longer to implement. But with our program cycle, the way we have it, even these midterm projects will be able to compete for funding within the next 3 to 6 months. And so that will allow them to go on to the design and the construction and let phases much quicker. A different case study that I wanted to share, this one is in the city of Fayetteville, and this one has some history to it. And it's not all good. Unfortunately, this was one that we learned a lot about to help us improve our programs. This was it started off as a reactive based hotspot investigation. So there was 4 pedestrian fatalities in a fairly short period of time, and they occurred back in 2000. 2010 through 2013, back when our entire program was reactive. So we were not investigating very many locations until after the crashes had occurred. And that was certainly the case on this corridor. So 4 pedestrian fatalities. We turned it into a corridor project after realizing that much more was needed. We were able to develop a lot of interim solutions that we were able to deliver quickly. We installed a couple RRFBs in 2014, about 500 feet apart. But one of the key things that came out of this was to do a pedestrian road safety audit, knowing that we weren't solving the entire problem of this corridor. You can see it's a wide road, it's a 5-lane road, a lot of commercial development. Some of the sidewalk is immediately behind the curb, very close to the roadway. And so we knew that the immediate reaction that we did would be helpful, but it would need more thought. So we did the interim solutions, delivered quickly, but moved into a road safety audit so that we could bring in a lot of additional experts as well to take a closer look at the road. We had, as I mentioned, the 4 pedestrian crashes in the 3 years prior to the RFBs. Fortunately, we have had none since then, and we continue to monitor this location. Most of the fatalities and the pedestrian crashes along this corridor were from out of town senior citizens and occurred from 7 to 9 p.m. at night. This is an interchange on I-95, which runs up and down the East Coast. So you have a lot of travelers heading up and down the East Coast that stop at this area. So it's mainly a mixture of restaurants and hotels. And so people were parking at the hotel, not wanting to drive anymore, and they were crossing the road to go to their restaurant for the evening meal. And that's what was leading to most of these fatalities. We did a lot of collaboration with the city of Fayetteville. They helped us improve lighting along the corridor. They helped hold public meetings and do a lot of outreach, and as well as a lot of education on the RRFBs. That was very beneficial. One of our goals is to have effective safety projects, and oftentimes with pedestrian treatments, in order for them to be effective, there is an education component that needs to be done to let the public know what you're doing, and in some cases you have to educate them on how to use the device too. So this corridor looks different now because as a result of the road safety audit and the collaboration with the city, we decided to use our HSIP program to continue to address risk along the corridor. So even though we had had no pedestrian fatalities after the initial RRFBs were installed, the risk level was high. We installed a median for about 1.5 miles to 2 miles through this, so that it was no longer a 5-lane section. We added many more RFBs all throughout the corridor. We improved lighting and bus stops and transit and sidewalk improvements up and down the corridor. So it looks very different now. This was also done through our program, and we knew it would take a lot longer to implement. But again, it was important to get the low-cost treatments in place early while we waited on the more expensive project to take place. Again, you can see additional RFBs up and down the corridor. One thing that we learned from this was the initial use of the RFB was somewhat low in terms of the pedestrians using the device as it was intended. But we quickly realized that as we added more and more RFBs on this corridor, the pedestrian compliance went way up and increased. And so that was definitely something that helped us consider that we needed to make sure that we were looking at corridors from a more complete perspective and not just as a series of spots, so that all of these fairly low cost improvements can work together. And again, that's some of the additional improvements that took place. One other study I wanted to briefly mention was our downtown Raleigh pedestrian safety study. And this is an example with a large area We mentioned that part of our program is focused on identifying cities and mid-sized cities and large cities to work with to improve pedestrian safety. This was a partnership with the City of Raleigh and our consultant BHB. And that's a pretty large area that's on the map there. That's around 50 blocks. I think over 70 intersections. This is the state capital of North Carolina, includes the state government complex. And we were asked to do a study to improve pedestrian safety where there's a lot of state employees in this area, probably over 20,000 state employees. And it was certainly you know, a challenging because of its size and scope, but the methods remained similar, where we were able to use crash data and risk data, a lot of public outreach, getting a lot of information from the people who live and work in the area that was able to, again, validate and supplement a lot of our data-driven processes. A lot of and this study, I should mention, is still ongoing. It's not quite complete yet. It's almost complete. But one of the more rewarding things that happened as part of this project so far was we were able to work with the City of Raleigh to go ahead and start implementation of things while the study was ongoing. Again, that whole concept, that whole notion of if we have problems that we've identified and we have solutions to those problems, what can we do to get those in ground quickly? And so while this project has been ongoing, the City of Raleigh has been able to implement LPIs in a broad area. And in addition, we were able to work with the City of Raleigh to come up with a plan to help manage speeds in the downtown area with the signal system and making some adjustments there, which is still ongoing. That's not complete either, but it was another example of being able to use the data-driven processes that we need to help us prioritize and get the information in place. But as soon as you have the problem identified and you've got the solutions in place, then to go ahead and develop those processes to make sure that something can get implemented, sooner than later. Jed's going to talk a little bit more, I think, about this overall project, so I won't say too much more on that. But with that, Dan, that's I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. A lot of good stuff there, and a lot of questions coming in. So please, folks, keep those coming. We do have that Q&A period that'll be coming up toward the end of the webinar. But for now, what we're going to do is switch things over to hear a perspective from the City of Raleigh. So Jed, I've got the screen headed your way, and I'll let you know when we see yours, and you're all set up and ready to go.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to kind of give a municipal perspective. A lot of the components Brian spoke of, I'm going to kind of go off of them and intertwine them and kind of give the city's perspective. So with that, kind of a real brief agenda. City's perspective on project development and delivery. As Brian kind of alluded to, government can be its own worst enemy. We're not necessarily known for being the quickest in terms of moving and producing project deliverables. So I kind of broke that down into a couple items, problems and solutions, and then some successes, some reasons for them, and go through a couple case studies. Problems and solutions. Raleigh is, as Brian alluded to, the state's growing. Raleigh's growing too. To kind of put it in perspective, over the last 15 years, the greater metro area has doubled in size. With that, sorry, let me move this one thing so I can see it a little bit better. With that growth, there's increased number of potential conflicts with more vehicles, more walkers, more cyclists. In addition to that, Raleigh was, I would even not used predominantly, was built around a vehicle-centric type mode of transportation. Kind of a paradigm shift here, although the mode split is still very heavy vehicle. A lot of infrastructure, new development is being built to encourage walkers, and we're seeing more, from greenways to more dense urban centers. So we have seen an increase in pedestrian activity specifically. As I kind of alluded to earlier, the items above are far from a problem. Most cities and jurisdictions would love to have growth and mode shifts, but they have played indirect role in the increased number of pedestrian crashes, in the sense that the growth is just increasing the potential conflicts. Let me see. So one good thing is FHWA and NCTOT have always done a good job of coming up with solutions. The Spectacular 7 were talked about earlier. As Brian alluded to, we kind of have our own toolkits. Prior to this was the first time I'd heard of them called the Spectacular 7, but needless to say, they're very good tools that we can use to apply to problematic locations where we have conflicts occurring. As with anything, solutions can come with problems or issues. As I mentioned earlier, governments have their own issues, so to speak, and funding is always one of them. And funding, I'll get to it in a little bit, isn't always prioritized in necessarily the way safety folks would want. Some of the other things is change is not always welcome. I know internally here in the state of North Carolina, and specifically Raleigh and a couple other municipalities, pedestrian hybrid beacons, or hawks, there was a fairly high reluctance to use them. People were engineers were fearful that people wouldn't understand them, not know what to do. We installed a few, and we had some CCTVs, and some of the driver behavior was a little comical to watch, but the pedestrians using them, it was very intuitive, and drivers have such adapted. Brian alluded to some public information campaigns. We were thinking of doing that with hawks, but we ended up not, and it turned out to be fine. Drivers ended up adapting. On the flip side, well, change is not always welcome. It can be very strongly welcomed. For example, we get inundated with emails about, we saw something like, for example, our RFB, fill in the blank location. Why can't we have it in our neighborhood? So there's a big push to use these new solutions. And then kind of the last thing is, in Raleigh, I suspect it's similar for other states and jurisdictions on this call, multi-jurisdictional areas. For example, state highway system is very large in North Carolina, and the majority of the larger roads in Raleigh fall on the state highway system, yet they fall in the city limits. So getting something done can take a little bit longer. It's just a little bit more added bureaucracy. As I mentioned earlier, government has limited funding, and safety projects are not always, for those that work in the safety industry, we always feel like we're underfunded. It seems to be that the shiny new capital projects or state improvement projects are the ones that get the bulk of the funding. Kind of put that in perspective, every fiscal year, my programs get about $500,000 for safety type projects, which could be RRFBs, things along the lines of that. But capacity and streetscape projects every year is probably in the $20 to $40 million range. Successes, kind of give you our take, or City of Raleigh's take of some of the reasons that we have had some successes. And Brian mentioned this, and working together, you achieve more. Throughout North Carolina, I suspect the same for other jurisdictions and states on this call. The relationships between locals and the states can run the gamut from great to not the opposite of great. The good news is that a while back, we started interacting very closely with DOT under the auspice that working together, we would achieve more. The taxpayer doesn't see the difference between state and local and even fed. They just know that they pay taxes at the pump and they want improvements. So we've been able to achieve a significant amount of improvements working together with the state. That is something that I can't stress enough. The other thing is careful consideration for countermeasures. One size doesn't fit all. Brian kind of alluded to if we have a solution, sometimes it can be a long gap in between when we get that out there. I'll kind of go over an example on that. One size doesn't fit all, and sometimes you have to do interim measures. From a city perspective, what has worked well for us, and you have to know your audience. If you educate and inform the policymakers, they can end up being your biggest cheerleaders and advocates. Conversely, depending upon the elected officials, they can't. So again, it comes back to knowing your audience. And lastly, in order to successfully implement some of these spectacular 7 or interim measures, takes a little bit of strategy on how to roll them out and install them. And I'll kind of give a couple case studies and examples coming up. This isn't downtown, the initiative that Brian was talking about, but it has to do with the spectacular 7 and kind of applying the old mantra to new mitigating measures. The location on the left, there is a school, I believe it's on the left side, and this was on a state highway system, although it was in Raleigh, and there was a pedestrian signal. And those familiar with the METCD, I think it's a litany of stuff, but I think the minimum pedestrian volume is over 100 pedestrians an hour, maybe 107, I can't remember off the top of my head. That being said, when you install something like a piece of infrastructure like a signal, it's very hard to remove it. Well, what happened at this location was the pedestrian signal didn't come close to meeting warrant, so it was green 99.9% of the time, and drivers just got used to it being green. Well, a student actuated the signal on his way to school, or her way to school, and got a walk indication and crossed, and a vehicle ended up hitting the student. The good news is the student wasn't seriously injured and is fine now, but it was a shot across the bow that maybe a prior countermeasure wasn't adequate for today. So what we did is we partnered with the state, we talked about it, and we have several avenues where we can get projects funded, but this was one where we decided not to seek outside funding and use internal forces. So the state designed a Hawk beacon, pedestrian hybrid beacon, and city forces did the install. Since we had a signal cabinet there, the work was minimal, some head change outs and some reprogramming, but we also put reflective backplates to get the attention of drivers. So now drivers can go through this, and again, they might get used to just those things being there, but when they're actuated by a student, the back plate and the way the beacons work really gets drivers' attention. We haven't had a crash since, and I hope this is a good example of how we're preventing crashes from the day we installed it and going forward. Another example is kind of one of our reiterative process. We're using interim measures and constantly seeking improvements. The photo on the left is a greenway crossing. Several years ago, I'd used the majority of the greenway and was kind of appalled at the traffic control at these greenways. The city spends a lot of money to build these greenways, and since greenways traditionally follow rivers and streams, they end up crossing the road at not necessarily ideal locations from a traffic engineering standpoint, mid-block. So what we did was we used some internal funds, worked with DOT, and we installed a refuge, some advanced yield marking shark teeth, and just increased the signage. I think there was some more signage we added after that. Unfortunately, during the last couple months with COVID, our greenways were open and people were out walking using the greenways a lot more. A person crossed this greenway, a car hit him, and a fatal resulted. Prior to that, we had talked about upgrading this location with a pedestrian hybrid beacon, again, going back to the constant improvements. Well, the work we did was an interim solution, and that might have prevented others. It didn't prevent unfortunately, the fatal that did occur. So the bad news is it takes a decent amount of time to get a pedestrian hybrid beacon installed, from coming up with the plans, advertising it. We like to use generally metal poles for maintenance, and the lead time for those is pretty significant. So we're looking at 12 months to 24 months to get that built. So what we recently did is we ordered a slew of RRFBs to install at these locations as interim solutions until the more permanent interim solution, or more permanent final solution being a Hawk, gets installed. The RRFBs will, once the Hawk goes in, we can repurpose them to other locations. So again, this is one where the Spectacular 7, you got to kind of use them all based on case scenarios. This is getting downtown, and this was part of the overall pedestrian plan that Brian was talking about. I think it falls within the area. The area that the state was focusing on was predominantly around the state campus, but we're working with the state, and we're going to take a lot of the tools and countermeasures that come from that study and apply them throughout the whole CBD. This was one that we did in-house. The photo on the left was a mid-block crosswalk. We counted it, and there was probably close to 100 pedestrians an hour crossing this. The transit hub is over on the right, and there's parking deck, and then on the left side is a major city building and access to the main street of Raleigh. What was occurring was box trucks were parking or queuing very close to the crosswalk, ignoring the parking restrictions. And what that did was obscure the pedestrians from oncoming traffic. And when you have two lanes, you get the dual threat where one might stop, obscure the pedestrian from car in the other lane. So we wanted to do kind of a road narrowing and use bump outs to shorten, to get the pedestrian more out in the roadway in a safe manner and shorten the pedestrian crossing. Going back to government bureaucracy, this happened to fall in a historic overlay district, and we were running into major issues with getting a traditional concrete and even using brick curb extension type thing. So one of the ways we kind of thought out of the box was both sides have on-street parking, so we put some bump stops and then put bike racks and some other stuff, which works to keep the box trucks and delivery vehicles from obscuring the pedestrians queued waiting to cross. Since we did that, we have gotten a lot of positive feedback. Ultimately, would like to go in and put some hardscape in, but this was going back to the previous slide, an interim measure, kind of using a couple of spectacular 7 to get an improvement. Last one I think I'm going to focus on was a big heavy lift type project. As part of the DOT project, one of the methods that we were trying to employ to reduce pedestrian crashes was the use of LPIs. Prior to a crash that kind of started that state initiative, the city had implemented the use of LPIs on our main street and 2 streets that run parallel north to south to the main street. The main street runs north to south. In the past, we had made a request for the state to consider the use of LPIs throughout the commercial business district of downtown. And DOT, Brian knows better than me, but 20,000 employees. And Brian's group's a safety group, but we had to get permission from another group to do that. And we got some resistance about doing that, concerns about vehicular delay. And our argument back was, well, a lot of the locations, the pedestrian traffic, which we have counts, is close to, if not, does not exceed the vehicular volumes at specific times of day. So then the state study came about, and that was kind of the leverage that we used with Brian's group to get this initiative done. So a couple of things we looked at when we did the LPIs is, one, the state partnered with us and they did the signal plans, which was a great help. The other thing is the LPIs were just going to be part of a multitude of improvements. I don't have a slide for it, but a lot of these streets downtown are one way, and they have channelization where they have dual turning movements, whether it's left or right, which can be very problematic for pedestrians. We've had a couple of incidents downtown where one vehicle yielded to a pedestrian in the crosswalk, and the other, whether they didn't see him or what, continued around and ended up colliding with a pedestrian. So one of the things we're going to look at in conjunction with this LPI initiative is changing some of the channelization, looking at the volumes. If the dual rights and dual lefts aren't warranted, we'll get rid of them and go with a single one. In addition to that, we're looking at no right turns on red. On the main streets, the main arterials through downtown, or thoroughfares, we are able to get a pretty good pronounced green band of and platoon of vehicles going. So depending upon where the driver is, they could be looking upstream for a gap and not see a pedestrian on their other side and start to make the movement and collide with the pedestrian. Again, this is one size doesn't fit all. We're going to have to look at the volumes and whatnot, but there's a lot of locations in downtown where we could probably implement a no right turn on red and not see any major significant impacts. For the implementation strategy of LPI is one of the things we wanted to do is manage change. We had one north-south street, our main street, built out with LPIs, and then the streets running north and south on either side of them. We ended up programming 50 in the course of, I don't know, 2 weeks maybe, throughout the downtown, almost all of the entirety of downtown. But we wanted to do it in a manner where pedestrian expectation wouldn't cause a potential issue where they would get a string of LPIs and then come up to an intersection that didn't. So we kind of worked with the state and came up with a rollout method where we would do corridors at a time. Some of the complications that occurred with that is we use a NCDOT predominant has a state contract for Econolite products, and we use Siemens products. So to get LPIs to work, we had to go back and forth with the state, which comes back to having really good, strong relationships with your partner. We were able to do that very quickly and well. And the first few that we did were time consuming and a lot of work to do. But the last few, we ended up being able to program them from our traffic control center. We sent a signal tech out to the cabinet, and when we pushed it out there, it would go and flash, and then next cycle, it would cycle through with the LPIs, and it was all done from our traffic control center, so we could do a lot in a very short period of time. With that, I guess it's question time, and I'm ready to turn it over.
All right, sounds great. Thanks so much, Jed. And let me do this. Let me just move the screen back over to my side. I've got a slide up here that has some information about how you can contact us and reach out in case we don't get to all the questions that came in. So I've got email addresses and contact information for our panel. We'll go through as many as we can. If we can't get to your question, I hope that you'll be able to reach out to one of us about that. First thing I wanted to start with, actually, Brian and Jed, I want you to both maybe weigh in on this question. You showcased a few examples of rectangular rapid flashing beacon locations as well as pedestrian hybrid beacons. And these are the two, I mean, within all the STEP webinars we've done, this is the question that always comes back to is agencies are just deciding between these two treatments for an uncontrolled crossing a lot of times in similar cases. And there's some overlap there with speeds and volumes where people aren't sure which is needed, a rectangular rapid flashing beacon versus a pedestrian hybrid beacon. And you all talked a little bit about these two countermeasures. I wanted to ask if you could share a little bit more, maybe recap some of your thinking and some of your decision making when considering these countermeasures. What types of locations are you really going to be moving from the RFB to the PHB, for example? What goes into that? And Jed or Brian, whoever would like to start first.
I can take a stab first, Brian.
Sure.
My view of our RFBs is kind of evolved. I always would, again, it's kind of case by case scenario. I think our RFBs work, in my opinion, work the best on smaller roads with lower speeds, namely 1 or 2 or 2 lanes or 3 lanes, 2 lanes maybe with a twiddle, something like that. That greenway crossing that I showed, we're going to have to put some RRFBs in the median in addition to have the sides delineated. I personally prefer a hawk or pedestrian hybrid beacon because pedestrians have been so used to when they push a button, they actuate a button, they get a indication that provides them a pretty much mostly conflict-free walk indication. The RFB doesn't do that, but you still have to actuate that. My preference would be to not always, but predominantly use pedestrian hybrid beacons. That being said, our RFBs are very easy to deploy. They're a lot cheaper. And in the right circumstances, lower speed roads, narrower crossings, they can provide a significant, I think the crash modification factor is pretty high for them.
No, that's great. Thanks so much, Jed. Brian, I guess I posed the same question to you between the two, how those decisions are made between the two treatments.
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it definitely is getting a lot of conversation in our state and amongst cities and nationally as well, because there's not I don't think there's very precise guidance on those roads where you know, that are somewhat higher volumes but lower speed. Obviously, if it's higher speed, then that can move the decision more toward the hybrid beacon. Using the case study that I showed in Fayetteville on Cedar Creek Road, where we had a series of RRFBs along that corridor, that's a 5-lane road. The speed limit is 35. It's inside the city limits, but operating speeds were over 35. So that's a multi-lane road. If we were starting on that corridor today, we would probably lean more toward the hybrid beacons, and the primary reason is because of the multi-lane aspect of it, the higher traffic volume, and the fact that there's not a lot of traffic signals out there, and so your gaps in that traffic can sometimes be minimal during certain times of the day. So today, I would probably encourage the hybrid beacon because of the higher operating speed, even though we do have a lower speed limit, and the multi-lanes and the higher traffic volume. When we made a decision back in 2013 to start with the RFBs, you know, the one reason that we did that was there were gaps in the traffic, especially in the time of day when people were crossing the road based on the type of users of that facility. And the pedestrian crossing volumes were actually quite low, you know, very low in some cases. It's just that the fatalities were occurring, and certainly there was additional protection needed. So because the pedestrian volumes were so low, that's what probably tilted those decisions towards the RRFB. But I kind of agree with Jed that as you have multi-lanes and as your volumes and speeds increase, then in that gray area, generally speaking, we're encouraging the use of the hybrid beacon.
No, thanks so much for that. I think that you hit a lot of those decision points that probably come up when agencies are faced with those types of locations. Jed, one quick follow-up for you. I think you may have shown a picture where you had a PHB application using I think you had a span wire as opposed to the mast arm, and I was just curious, some questions about what that did for the cost and the ease of implementation at that particular location.
Yeah, we ended up, we have several on span wire as opposed to mast arm. North Carolina uses a lot of wood poles as permanent poles. I know a lot of states view wood poles as temporary. Because we worked with DOT on that, we have a line truck and we could build that very quickly using span wire. That's why we use span wire. From a functionality standpoint, it works fine. And we've had no issue with it. If it were a funded project per se, we would have rather had it been metal, but again, this was one that a solution popped up and DOT agreed to work with us, and we were able to get a project finished, bring it to the finish line a whole lot quicker by using in-house forces as opposed to contracting it out.
Got it. Yeah, very, very helpful. Thanks very much for that. Brian, circling back early on in your presentations, we had some questions coming in about some of the fundings that you were using for those to support a lot of these safety projects, and just some clarifying questions for you to compare with what other states are doing. Some questions about sort of what your annual HSIP budget looks like in terms of that amount that you all are using, and then whether there's a specific amount that you all kind of formally set aside for ped bike type projects like some of the ones you were showing, or if those are more folded into just general projects.
Yeah, that's a good question. So North Carolina receives a little over 64 million each year for federal funds on our HSIP, and that's you know, for all aspects of our program. We also receive about $12 million a year of state funds, and that the state funds, we typically combine those funding sources to use them in the best way that's possible to address the safety needs. We do not have a direct set aside for any of our focus areas, whether it's lane departure or intersection or pedestrian. And one reason for that is we really encourage our safety projects and the project development to be very inclusive. And so one of our like with our intersection projects, we may be addressing a red light running issue, or we may be addressing a frontal impact crash issue that's very vehicle focused. But as part of our standard practices and our operating procedures, our staff are going to look for any pedestrian needs that need to be addressed at that intersection, especially if it's in an urban area. And so the project might have a vehicle-based initiative, but we're going to be adding crosswalks and countdown ped heads or LPIs or special phasing treatments, signs, markings, whatever we need to for the pedestrian as part of that project. And so instead of getting caught up into is this project, is it ped focused, or is it vehicle focused, or is it frontal impact or road departure? It's a good safety project is what we're trying to deliver. And so what we have found is that sometimes with the set aside approach, you sometimes end up limiting your program as opposed to helping your program. We do have a competition-based program, and what we are focused on is making sure that our data-driven processes and the collaboration that we have with local governments is getting those high-risk projects funded and getting them into our mix. And we really don't want to put a limit on that. If it's a few million a year, then we're going to go out and develop more the next year. We're comfortable with an on-hold list. In other words, we generally have more projects submitted than we ever have funding for. And what that does is it helps mean that the best projects are the ones that are going to get funded first. That competition does help. So no, we intentionally do not develop a specific set aside for pedestrian or intersection or lane departure. We have found that would actually probably result in spending less in that area instead of more.
Mm-hmm. No, that's an interesting approach. I think it certainly all inclusive of multiple types of road users in one project. I had a question. I think this is a good one for both Jed and Brian to both tackle if you can. A lot of questions from communities or folks who are doing these sorts of projects where they're getting some pushback from the community, possibly a lot of times maybe it's the driving community who feels that some of these ped and bike projects are sort of taking up their roadway space for these other road users, and they may not see the value in that. And I saw a couple of comments about some of the median projects restricting left turns, but possibly an access management style project might not be the most favorite thing of that business that might be located along that road if you're restricting turns into their driveways. I'm sure that you both have encountered this sort of pushback against safety projects before, and I guess I wonder how you typically go about kind of countering that, responding, considering it as you continue to move forward and making these important safety improvements. How to consider that potential pushback. And Jed or Brian, whoever would like to weigh in on that first.
Sure, I'll lead off on that. We do in North Carolina, we do pretty significant push on access control, access management, and adding medians onto roads, especially where you have a lot of commercial development, a lot of driveways. And this, in some cases, we've added those medians specifically for pedestrian reasons. In many cases, it's for both. We add in medians where we have a 5-lane road or a 3-lane or a 7-lane, cross section to reduce turning movement crashes, frontal impact crashes, but also provide that refuge for those citizens that are going to cross in areas that they choose to, regardless of the infrastructure that may be in place. That's the median. The presence of a median has a definite positive effect on pedestrian safety. It is a challenge though with businesses. It's a challenge to communicate to them that their business is going to continue to operate and that they're not going to lose money as a result of that median. We have done a good bit of work over the years with economic analysis on businesses that are impacted by medians. It's a battle each time, and it's continuous. It's one that involves a lot of public workshops and outreach. And we've had more successes than failures, but we don't win them all. But it's a continuous process.
Jed, any feedback on that question of how you kind of go about countering or managing maybe the pushback you might get on some of these projects?
Yeah, me and my staff talk about this very frequent, that safety and efficiency are often at odds. A good example would be protected left turn. It's an extra phase. It slows down the intersection, but it minimizes the potential associated with a permissive left turn. A lot of these solutions and mitigating measures that we pursue, there's always going to be a trade-off. One good thing is DOT's been good with doing this, and we do the same thing. Is we kind of let the data help us make the decision. A lot of data-based decision making. That's not always the case. Sometimes we have to do something, and it'll upset business, like access management or whatnot. But for the most part, a lot of our decision making is based on crash patterns that are emerging, which is unfortunate that it has to come to that. But at least we have something to stand on then, in terms of everything's not a win-win. And while we might be impacting efficiencies and accessibility, we are improving safety.
Oh, great, thank you. I like that recommendation to kind of lean back on your data and be able to show that as a reason for making your decisions. That's valuable. Brian, I had to go back to a question, something you talked about. You showed at least one example, maybe more, of how you've used field review and road safety audits to learn more about a site before making improvements. And it seems like you can really glean a lot of really useful information about a site that you're not able to get at with your maybe more quantitative analysis on the front end. And I wanted to ask if that's a routine part of your process with these safety projects to do those road safety audits, or if it's mainly is it used mainly where you suspect a high risk, but you may not have the crash events that have occurred there to make it rise up the list, I guess, in terms of a hotspot. So I'm curious about how the RSA process is folded in.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have found tremendous success with the road safety audit mechanism, and it's not used in every situation. There's many locations where our trained staff are going to engage with the local government, with the NCDOT field divisions, and will be able to review that location and come up with tried and true countermeasures, proven countermeasures that work, without necessarily doing a full road safety audit. But as the complexity goes up, whether especially for corridors or areas such as we mentioned with the downtown Raleigh one or the NC 54 corridor, and even the corridor in Fayetteville, having that road safety audit where you're bringing in those groups of people, diverse perspectives, we have found that to be very valuable in two ways. One, it can generate new ideas that were not considered, but often what happens more than that is it generates consensus and support. And so if you're bringing in the right people to the road safety audit, sometimes it's not about coming up with an idea that you would not have come up with otherwise. Sometimes it's about including those people as part of the process early on, so that when you get to the tough recommendation, such as a median or access control or a PHB, you've already built in hopefully consensus and support from some of your key decision makers, or you've built in support with team members that can then go back to their city council or other groups and say, yes, this is a tough decision, but it's worth it. So sometimes the road safety audit is about the interpreting the analysis, but in many cases it's a form of outreach.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. That's a great case to be made for the RSA. Jed, we had some questions about the LPI. You talked about a few of those leading pedestrian interval projects that you are working on, and just a few follow-up questions on those. Well, some about the right turns and others about accessibility. I guess I'll start with the accessibility question, and that is, are you, for your LPI deployments, are you enabling or able to enable accessible pedestrian signals along with those? There's been we've done some webinars recently and heard more feedback about the audible indicators that are needed for a person who's blind or has low vision to use that LPI. If you can't see it, it's not much use to you. So I wonder if Raleigh is doing any experimenting with using those audible indicators in conjunction with the LPIs to enhance their accessibility.
Very good question. I know entity like the PROAG recommends the use of accessible pedestrian signals everywhere. That being said, they are very expensive to install, and actually a surprising irritation is a lot of in urban area, people complain about the auto locator tone. We've had issues where if power fluctuates, as a safety measure, it restores to the highest setting. So the way we have rolled out APSs is we have a very good relationship with our state DHHS, Health and Human Services, and also there's a Governor Moorhead School of the Blind in Raleigh, real close, and we have really good close relationship with them. And what we do is we install them on request. All someone has to do is make a request, and we will bend over backwards to get those devices installed. And we work with DHHS and the Governor Moorhead School for Blind to provide maps of locations for training and for their clients. So in downtown, we have a handful of locations with LPIs with APSs, and obviously the APSs tell the person that they can walk, so they don't. The visual indication is there's no loss there. Locations where we don't have them, if a visually impaired person were to use it, they obviously won't be able to see or have any kind of indication that it was okay to walk. But again, we're very receptive and happy to help. We just don't have the budget necessarily to roll them out on all locations. So if we get one request at any location downtown, we will install it. But we do have LPIs running at APS locations, but not all.
Gotcha. Thank you for that. And I guess another side of the LPI, and these might go together, or you may have mentioned it independently. You talked about restricting right turns on red. I assume you may be doing that along with your LPIs. I know that's in the case a lot of places. And at any place where you're restricting your right turns, there's some questions about what sort of signage you're using to communicate that to the driver. I know there's the more traditional static message sign, but I've seen some of the newer ones that are that rest in blank, and then when the red light's on, they illuminate to show right turn on red. Are you using any of those, or have you had success when you implement restricting right turns with a certain type of signage or otherwise communicating that to the driver?
Very good question. If it wasn't for COVID, we wouldn't have implemented the LPIs downtown so quickly and vigorously. In conjunction to that, we also did some signal timing exercises where we adjusted the offsets slightly to try and, we had, as part of the DOT study, we found that speed compliance was not very good on the major corridors. So we tried through signal timing to get that speed, the 85th speed, more in line with what the posted is. We ran that exercise and the LPIs during the, I guess, first month of the kind of stay-at-home order for COVID, which made things easy, because if we were to do it normally in normal traffic conditions, especially with the signal component, we will get probably inundated with concerns and colorful complaints. So we were able to do that so that when drivers return back to normal, they probably won't notice a change. The right turn on red prohibition, that's going to run on a separate track. Ideally, if COVID hadn't came, we probably would have waited. But the right turn on red, we want to do it with some larger items in conjunction with DOT once they wrap up their study. The no right on reds and some of the channelization changes probably will be met with some public backlash. For example, a couple of the locations we're talking about, there's a very high number of pedestrian activity, but there's dual rights, and there's a parking deck, I don't know, 100 feet away. So we've already got complaints from users of the parking deck that they can't egress quick enough from the parking deck. So if we got rid of the capacity, the dual rights, their egress time would increase slightly. Again, going back to there's trade-offs, but the right on reds and some of the channelization changes, they're going to occur probably a little bit later this year. And it wasn't quite as critical for them to happen concurrent because traffic volumes dropped so dramatically due to COVID.
Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thanks for all that. And I think I've got time to ask this one more question, if maybe another if I can get to it. But Brian, it's one for you. I'm reminded by some of the comments that we've got folks on who don't necessarily represent their transportation agency. They may be in the community advocating for some of these safety improvements and want to see and want to work with maybe transportation agencies to get those done. And I'm kind of curious if you'd offer advice or thoughts on the ways that you've seen community groups and organizations and really individuals, residents that have been most successful in working together with transportation agencies such as NCDOT to get safety improvements made. Any useful tips you could share about how that process could work most successfully?
Yes, so we have worked with many different groups, and yeah, there's some groups are more active from a policy perspective or wanting to have laws or funding processes changed, and there's space at the table for those discussions. Other groups are much more focused on their neighborhood or particular street or location. And typically those groups are fairly easy to get engaged. They are able to participate in the road safety audits. They can often help spread the communication for surveys or public meetings. They can be very beneficial to help broaden the outreach tools that we try to use. So there's definitely ways for them to be engaged, and they should be engaged. Some cases, a tragic event has taken place, and an advocate group will become much more engaged as a result of that fatal crash. Sometimes in those, as the emotions are high, which is understandable in those situations, it can be more challenging to find that common ground, but it's always there. And that's really what the process is when you work with these groups, there is always common ground. And that's, in my opinion, the first place to start is, identify those areas that we agree on and identify the area that is in common, and then work to enlarge that space. And it's doable.
Right. No, thanks, Brian. I think it's a great place to leave it, and some good advice there for everybody, no matter what position they're in, to kind of make some of these changes. We haven't talked about a lot of the STEP resources, the individual STEP resources in a while. So I wanted to mention a few of those as we close out. Kristen Brookshire at the Highway Safety Research Center has sent out a couple of links, and I want to make sure you see those, especially the STEP guide for uncontrolled crossings, table 1, which is really some of the heart of that guide, really laying out how you can use roadway factors such as lane configuration, volume, and speed to help select the right countermeasure for a given site. That's been really valuable, I think, to a lot of agencies, and it's what we draw from now to really help us figure out what is the right tool for the job. So take a look at those, as well as some of those other tech sheets that really lay out and case studies that really lay out the details of these countermeasures, how they can be used, and what the research is behind them. That's all very useful, I think, in coming up with the right solution for a problem. I want to thank you all for joining us today on this webinar. We are going to have some coming up. Again, I mentioned road diets and regional approaches to pedestrian safety will be coming very soon. Please follow up with us and with our panelists if you have other questions. If we can help you with your pedestrian safety projects, we'd be happy to respond to you and point you in the right direction. I want to thank Becky, Brian, and Jed very much for spending time with us today and sharing their stories and case examples. And I want to thank all of you for attending the webinar today, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody.